but even though, so he has a notion that there is a history of philosophy, or that the first beginning has somehow or other come to an end, right? And that we're now anticipating, in some sense, this new beginning. But there is, nevertheless, this fundamental continuity, and the continuity is the enoning, if you want, in my language, the imperative to use his. I think he uses the term. He uses the term here. He appropriates it from Kierkegaard in his own context. But the imperative to leap into this abgrund, this between the first and the second beginning, to own it. Really, it's really to own it. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Were you going to ask something? And generally speaking, if there are questions based on the assignment, I'm sorry.
No, coming from outside of philosophy, I have probably an ignorant question, but
those are the best. Those are the best.
I am unclear as to the distinction between ontology,
right,
and metaphysics.
I'm sorry to say it first off the cuff. My first answer to that is somewhat ambiguous, what the distinction might be. But Heidegger maybe helps clarify that, right? Because the term metaphysics and ontology could be. I think it's fair to say, for example, go back to Aristotle, who wrote the Metaphysics. Well, his metaphysics is his ontology. So the question arises: if I'm going to talk about being as being, right, which is Aristotle wants to do, which is the being, ontology, that's what we're talking about, the study of the onta, right, of the things that are, insofar as they are. Well, for Aristotle, that is metaphysics, because he distinguishes that, and this is maybe the influence of Plato, even on the Aristotle who otherwise, and here I use this with a small I, wants to incarnate the Platonic ideas. He wants to see the Platonic ideas as not as another world. And I have to qualify this. It's not that simple either. The prime mover and the other unmoved movers, in some sense, for Aristotle, are separate from the world. That is, by world I mean something like what Heidegger means, or Husserl or Descartes, or the external world. You see, but Aristotle wouldn't look at it that way, external. But the physical world, right? The divine beings, the prime unmoved mover, who is the prime chief, and the many, the plurality, 55 or so he takes a guess, based on his analysis of the physical universe, and this will kind of show you where I'm going. There are 55 or so unmoved movers in a kind of hierarchical arrangement that corresponds to the hierarchical structure of the physical universe as Aristotle understands it. So, as it were, no one has actually done this, but they are assigned, each of these unmoved movers, to some aspect of the physical universe to be the cause, the proximate ultimate cause, if I could put it that way. Right? The proximate ultimate cause of the motion. So because everything is embedded for Aristotle in a sphere. So when we look at the moon, Aristotle understands the moon to be in a sphere, and the sphere is what's going around, carrying the moon with it. See? Now that I'm saying this, I'm thinking this is very interesting. So where is Where is Einstein in Aristotle? It's in the notion of the spheres, and it's very interesting. So Einstein, who gave us the notion of the space as a geometrical grid, right? That's his big move over Newton. In his own way, he went back to Aristotle then, because Aristotle has a very geometric understanding of the embeddedness of the planets and the stars in spheres, and those spheres became the geometrical grid of Einstein. Isn't that great? I love that. And it corresponds to Heisenberg. Now, and you can't get Einstein and Heisenberg on the same wavelength, right? You can't get the relativistic. Yeah. You can't get the relativism of Einstein's macrocosmic theory, which works very well in the macrocosm. You can't get it quite in sync with the microscopic subatomic world of quantum mechanics, and that's what they're still working. That's the whole challenge of this thing called the grand unified theory, right? To solve that, to figure out what quantum gravity is and how it relates to the other fundamental physical forces. Okay, Aristotle. So that was a little aside, which just dawned on me. I really like it. Okay, but notice, therefore, while the absolutely, in Aristotelian terms, formal or absolute actuality, which each of these unmoved movers is qua actuality separate from the physical world that depends for its moving upon them, right? It's not a Platonic separation. In other words, and this is true of, therefore, what I'm really driving at is all actuality, all divine elementness, right, which moves the human soul ultimately. All of the God elements in the universe, large and small, are, unlike Plato, they have a positive relationship in Aristotle to the physical world, and the positive relationship, the key category for Aristotle is causality. Right? In other words, when Plato looked at the relationship between his world of the ideas, which would be roughly analogous to, an idea would be a living idea for Plato, right? Not a concept. It would be a living form. It would be the true form. And in that sense, although Plato doesn't speak quite this way, I don't think consistently or obviously so, these ideas are really divine things. You see, because they're eternal, they're immortal, and they embody intelligibility. They are intellects, as it were. And there's a hierarchy of them. But when Aristotle looks at and he went to school with Plato for 20 years, see, and he never heard what he wanted to hear from Plato. He liked the idea that there are eternal, divine things. Right? The real world is eternal, and it's multiplied, multiplicitous, unlike Parmenides, who made everything one. So Plato's genius was to be able to, he was not alone. All the Greek philosophers after Parmenides had to do this one way or the other, but Plato's way of doing it was he concretized the eternal Parmenidean being. By concretize, he specified it, but when he specified it as something apart from the world of our material physical experience, time and space, although space is a problematic term here. And so Plato's notion, which I think we all know sooner or later, is that the world is modeled on the real world of immaterial ideas. And so the relationship is one of imitation, sometimes referred to, or participation is another way in which methexis is translated. So Plato understood that the world somehow reflects. Right, so that was probably his working image. It was an image of time is the moving image of eternity. Well, the world is the moving image of the eternally living body, which is totally immaterial, and of which he speaks in the Timaeus, which is referenced, I think, in Faith and Philosophy. Okay, so Aristotle comes along and he says, so I'm saying, in what way Aristotle is really a Platonist, and which way he is not. Okay, he is because he accepts that the ultimate actuality, the ultimately real, is eternal and unmoving. That's why all the gods, the Aristotelian unmoved movers, are unmoved movers. Right? But unlike Plato, he establishes what I'm calling now, I'm just making up the language as I go along, a positive relationship between those eternal realities, and the physical world, a positive relationship, whereas, relatively speaking, Aristotle would understand the insufficiency of Plato in my language would be that it's a negative relationship. The world is not the really real world. Aristotle puts a positive relationship in it. It's called causality, right? So all these what would be the Platonic ideas of Plato now have a relationship to the world, not simply as that of which the world is an insufficient copy, to say a deficient copy, but more positively, more constructively, the relationship is causality. The world is what it is because it is caused to be so by that eternal world. Now, what was your original question?
Difference between metaphysics and
okay.
ontology.
All right. So when Aristotle thinks about being, all right, it's somewhat paradoxical precisely because he takes seriously what I'm calling a positive relationship of causality between the physical world and the metaphysical, the world, the reality beyond beyond the physics, you see, then for him ontology is concerned with the metaphysical being, the real being of the physical world, which is metaphysical being. He just finished the physics. He already did the physics. You see? Now we want to know, and he discovers at the end of the physics, this is something if you have appear before the Supreme Court, you have to. If at the end of the physics, Aristotle, who had no interest in had no knowledge of, could not have, right? He was not an evangelical Christian fundamentalist, right? He could not be that, right? But he understood that there has to be a cause of the motion of the world that he had described quite thoroughly in the physics. So in Book 8, the last book of the physics, he discovers the unmoved mover as the only adequate explanation for the ultimate explanation for the motion of the world. Right? I can move the book, but what moves me to move the book? So, okay. So that in the physics we have in effect. I don't recall that he would say anything like this, but in effect you have the opening to the announcement of the dependence of the physical world on a metaphysical world. So what being the world has, it's caused to be, but it's not caused to be, since I'm on this broad topic, it's not caused to be in the way in which the omnipotent creator of biblical and specifically medieval Christian faith causes the world to be. The unmoved mover and his assistants, as it were, in the hierarchy of unmoved movers, cause the world to be not simply, as Thomas Aquinas would say, but it's not esse simpliciter, not simple to be, act of being. The unmoved mover doesn't cause the world to be simply. The unmoved mover causes the world to be the way it is. It's the cause of the motion of the world, not the cause of the simple being of the world. And that therefore, what Aristotle is saying, and what follows from that immediately, I mean, without having to say it, is that the physical world, is as eternal as the eternal causes which cause it to be the way it is, because they have always been. They don't change, and they have always been causing it to be the way it is. And if it has always been being caused to be the way it is, that is to move, the motion of the world is eternal, and the motion of the world is the perfectly spherical motion of the highest sphere, which encompasses all the others, right, which has been going on eternally, is the closest approximation, as it were, to absolute lack of motion that you can get in what Aristotle would not quite call, but in effect, the res extensa, right? If you have a world of spheres, if you have a geometrical world of time and space, as it were, again, I qualify the term space, because I think in Aristotle there's no space at all, right? There's only place, which is another issue. But it's an issue not irrelevant to Heidegger. Okay, so the world is eternal. So when we get to the medieval point, the medieval situation where not only does Thomas's faith require him as a thinker to explain how it is, not how it happens that the appearances of bread and wine are kind of, my language now, free-floating. You know, they don't have a substance of their own, so to speak. But analogously, if the world was created ex nihilo, you see, then I have a different understanding of the relationship of potentiality and actuality, which we've touched on in a number of different contexts in here, than Aristotle could ever possibly have. He would have no need, he would have no opportunity, he would have no occasion, he had no faith in the very special sense we're talking about here. He had no cause of simple being. All right, so the cause of simple being, which is the cause of the simple being of the creation. So the God who creates the world ex nihilo, in Thomas's language, is a universal agent. And although he doesn't, I don't think he ever quite pins the label on Aristotle by name. It's very clear that Thomas understands, although he doesn't want to stress it, because he wants to show all the as much continuity between Aristotle's thought and Christian theology and Christian philosophy, if that's the right, I'm not sure it's the right term, sacred doctrine is his term. He wants to show as much continuity as possible, so he doesn't really, I don't think he ever emphasizes the difference, except when really put in the corner, which I think is only once or twice in very special contexts. So what I'm getting at is, although he may not put Aristotle's name in the same paragraph, for Thomas, the notion of divinity in the ancient world, and I'm saying implicitly, if not explicitly, including the unmoved mover of Aristotle, is that such an agent, such a cause of motion, not of simple being, is therefore a particular agent, as opposed to the universal agent that the God who creates the world ex nihilo is. I'm not still sure whether I've answered your question yet.
Well,
yeah, I think.
So why is there continued use of metaphysics versus ontology? Heidegger speaks.
Well, because it has a new meaning. Well, I guess you could say a short answer to that, which is, I'm afraid it's going to get us off again.
Well,
No, it's all right. The short answer to it, I think, is it's Descartes' fault, right? In other words, Descartes starts off by establishing. Here's where it gets complicated. If you buy the notion that the metaphysical is some sort of immaterial being, in Aristotle it causes the physical universe to be the way it is, and does so, by the way, not in any simply non-multiplied state, because there's a multiplicity of beings there, right? Now think of Descartes. Descartes is in the position, I think this issue came up somewhere along the line here, maybe in one of the articles that you gave me by that scholar, whose name is, I'm blocking now. I don't know whether it came up directly, but
yeah.
Yeah.
I remember.
But we spent some time talking about Descartes. It must have been when we were doing Faith and Philosophy. I don't know whether you were here for that. Okay, that's it. Yeah, so we did talk about, at some length, Descartes in here because we were using Faith and Philosophy as a text in one of our courses. And I don't know whether I said it explicitly then, I probably did, but I can say it now. If you stop and think about it, Descartes, if I looked at this from Aristotle's point of view, first of all, it's complete insanity, complete nonsense. It makes no sense to Aristotle at all. It never would occur to him to do anything like Descartes did, but of course he didn't have Thomas Aquinas' background. He didn't have a universal agent that was creating the being of the world simpliciter, right? Simply. So, but Descartes did. But Descartes, and here's the continuing relevance of Aristotle, and I think the answer to your second question is, who is the Descartes of the Meditations? He is a res cogitans. He is a metaphysical being. He's got himself inside what would have been the position of the unmoved mover, as it were. Do you see? And he is quite a particular agent, okay, and and a finite one too. Now, of course, Hegel is going to absolutize this, right? But the absolute idea of Hegel is, as Hegel says, Hegel will understand it and does understand it as Aristotle more deeply determined, and that depth that he's talking about is his penetrating absolutely to the center, to the inside of what otherwise in Aristotle is a black box, the unmoved mover. Aristotle knows it to be an absolute actuality, an absolute mind, and so on, but there's no penetrating it because it is absolutely in contact with it. There's no room, there's no crack, there's no crevice in the identity of the knower and the known that is, by definition, the, as it were, epistemological definition of a divine mind. Do you see? There's no way of getting inside of it. Right? So you could say that Christian faith cracked open, do you see, the divine mind as it existed outside of the context of faith. In cracking it open, it made room, do you see, for the entrance of. I'm skipping over a couple of steps here, but it made ultimately possible for Descartes to move in and occupy what is at least formally the place of the divine mind. And therefore it's not at all surprising. Now, of course, it's not that simple. It's complicated because along with this, I've got to buy the transubstantiation idea. I've got to buy a radical break between substance and appearance. Okay? And if I buy that, then I've got to become, sooner or later, I've got to become Kant. And then if I buy that radical break in the form of Kant, but I think Kant has gone too far in that direction, because I want to go back to, on another level, even though I have a lot of problems with Descartes, if I'm Hegel, I want to go back to the occupying, the being inside of the divine mind. Kant has given me a nice sharp Eucharistic break between appearance and substance, but he's done so at the expense of saying that we really can't know if there really is a divine mind. We have an idea of it, but we have, right? So it's become again something remote. I want to get inside of that. So I'm Hegel. I have to bring the substance and the appearance together, the noumenon and the phenomenon together in some way, and I do that simultaneously with incorporating that unity in the dialectical process, which is really the inner working, of the divine mind, which is now really shown to be in continuity with the move that Descartes made, but in such a way that the individual finite addition of the absolute infinite divine mind, right, is, I would say, absolutely relativized to the latter, right, the former to the latter, so that the individual ceases to have a truth of its own, or the truth of any individual godlike human intellect in the modern period, you see. The truth of it is its participation in, its thorough exemplification of, its instantiating of the absolute idea, which in another context is the world spirit for Hegel, right? So it gets temporalized in that sense. But in other words, so Napoleon is divine, you see, as a world historical actor, but he is divine by participate. I mean, he's not divine, just as Jesus Christ is not divine for Hegel, concretely, except insofar as to vanish. So Napoleon is on stage playing the part. Oh, this is so interesting. What was I reading? I'm reading Agamben again. This guy is a really provocative guy. Agamben is provocative. And he has a little the end of the poem or end of poetry?
I haven't read that one.
Okay. Well, the first essay is on Dante's choice of the term comedy for the Divine Comedy. What does it really mean? And of course, Agamben is going to complicate it before he gives you the answer. But in the course of it, he talks about the notion of person and the development of person. It's just too much. This is too much. What person, of course, is the persona. The Romans use persona as the mask. And Agamben has a very intricate analysis of all of this and everything. But as I was reading it, so forget what Agamben says, but it was occurring to me that when I talk about absolute participation, the persona is, when you wear the persona, you're playing your part in the drama, okay? Agamben has his own reasons for making the distinction between what is behind the mask and the persona, and then he makes a distinction between two possibilities: the possibility of identifying oneself with the mask, and the other one is keeping the mask at a distance and recognizing the mask as something just to be taken up and put down again, and so forth and so on. And so it has to do with his analysis of the possibility of tragedy in the modern period, right? And Dante's comedy is such because the mask is not, as it were, this is my language, taken as seriously after, in the context of Christian theology and the notion of sin and redemption and so forth. I can't go into it. I just give you a feel for it, the relevance of it. But it occurred to me, and it's relevant somehow or other here. Hopefully we can be able to articulate it at the right place. I think it's also relevant to Heidegger because I'm saying when he talks about earlier, in one of the earlier assignments, he talks about individuation. He uses in the German text, because German appropriates a lot of Latin terms without change. So for example, when Kant talks about, this came up in the morality seminar, when he talks about limitation, right? I don't know how you would say it with a German accent, but the limitation is just a Latinate form, which is directly appropriated by German. So individuation, I guess it would be, is also used by Heidegger at that point, right? And I was making the point that, yes, he understands that being is involved in the kind of radical individuation, you see? And it's at least analogous to what the thinking now occurring understands by an absolute particularization, but I was making the distinction between the individual as the third moment in the logical sequence and the particular as the second moment, right, see? And saying, in effect, that there's no beyond the particular. Right? When I talk about absolute particularity in the thinking now occurring, what I'm really saying, there's no beyond the particular in either logical direction. It's not preceded by a universal, and it's not followed by an individualizing moment. Okay, and so I was thinking, in terms of Agamben's distinction between the mask and the bearer of the mask. I would have no particular objection, and I might find an occasion to write this down somewhere, right? But absolute particularization is another way of putting it, and I think it's clear from the context in which we've been using this kind of language. It's absolute personhood, and I really don't care if it's absolute personahood, because at this point, when there's nothing but schema, right? There's nothing but mask. It's not nothing but mask in the sense that there is only appearance, like there was a missing substance. Well, then how can it be only? See, it's not really only appearance, but how could there be something that at first glance might appear to be only appearance, right, without any reference to substance? It's because that mask, that schema, that part, absolutely does not pre-exist. It's being created absolutely now. So in other words, there's no room, there's no space, there's no distance in which the hesitation, see, the lack of immediacy would arise, in which I would have a sense even a sense, no anxiety, in which I have even a sense, right, that there was something missing, or that there was a nothing. Right? No nothing. I don't care whether nothing's inside or outside the world. In the thinking now occurring, there ain't no nothing, period. I tell you, I was going to put it on my tombstone. There ain't no nothing. In quotes.
We'll remember that. We got it on tape.
And if they forget to do it, you come and you chisel it on some night. All right, now, I guess I think it's helpful, at least as a general. It's keeping us from the text for momentarily, but I'm going to jump around in the text anyway. So, are there any other questions?
How much do you want to deal with the question of discourse and statement? Do you want to just skip through that?
Well, I may want to stop off on it, but I want to go back to. I want to start with a brief reference, because it comes up again indirectly in today's reading. So just calling attention to something that you mentioned you were interested in around page 70 and following on the question of relevance. And on page 7, he's talking about really the context of useful things. And the world as a totality is the context of useful things here. It's the context of reference, might be another way of putting it. It's the world is that field in which these distinctions that he makes between in order to, for what, for the, right? What does he say? The what for, the what with, and so forth. All of these relations, okay, constitute the relatedness, which is the very structure of things in the world. They're related. Now, they're related in a somewhat hierarchical way. They're not simply related on the horizontal plane, as it were, although I have to be careful about importing these notions of horizontal and vertical here, but speaking analogously at least, right? And so the ultimate frame of reference for the relevance of things in the world is Dasein, as that for the sake of which the things in the world are. And Sartre, in Being and Nothingness, he runs with this idea, right, in his own terms, right? Because for Sartre, he took a lot from Heidegger. What he didn't like about Heidegger was this Heidegger's insistence on making the distinction between Dasein and consciousness. But you see, it's interesting. It's a position Sartre here. Sartre's opening move in the transcendence of the ego is to excise the ego from Husserl's transcendental subjectivity and to place it, as it were, on the side of the world, right? So if subjectivity is phenomenologically dealing with an object, the object world, and all the subsidiary objects that might be associated with that, in Husserl, there is a continuing polarity between the ego and the world that is intended, right, in this subjectivity. And Sartre's criticism is that that's botching things up to have the ego in the subjectivity, which it's introducing something that really belongs on the side of the world, that really is lacks the transparency, the nothingness, as it were, the openness, if I think in Heideggerian terms, that is appropriate to subjectivity. So what I want to say is that, what I was about to say, I think, was that the way in which Heidegger gets rid of the ego, you'll notice every once in a while he makes clear that he's not talking about even if he talks about a self or some kind of a subjectivity, every once in a while he reminds us he's not talking about an egoistic ego, right? An ego self. So Heidegger is the first guy who wants to get rid of the ego, but he doesn't get rid of the way Sartre does. He gets rid of it by getting down underneath the world, the polarity of ego and world. Did you say? Getting down to this more primordial being in the world, which is being in the world, as he says in today's reading. Dasein is in the world ahead of itself, already in the world ahead of itself, in relationship to the world. Therefore, there's no time, in every sense of the word, there's no time when there is no world for Heidegger, right? So he's down, as it were, underneath the distinction between ego and world. The classical metaphysical, see, the roots of that distinction are metaphysical in Descartes, right? The Cartesian ego, okay, is opposed to, problematically, of course, but it's nevertheless distinguished from the res extensor, it's distinguished from what Heidegger refers to as res extensor, has to do with a reality in this egoistic sense, you see, which he wants to get down beneath, all right? So another way of understanding Heidegger, we're not doing metaphysics here. The way he avoids doing metaphysics, you see, is that he gets to the more fundamentally ontological, non-metaphysical experience of being there, you see, whereas Sartre doesn't disagree with Heidegger as far as it were, calling into question the validity of the polarity of ego and world. Sartre and Heidegger are in agreement on that, but it bothers Sartre that Heidegger has achieved this overcoming of this polarity at the expense of consciousness. So I now have to, if I'm Sartre, I want to restore the primacy of consciousness, and in order to do that, I just boldly reach in and take the ego out of it, put it over on the side of the world. Okay, so there's a dance. There's always a dance in the history of thought. Is some kind of a dance. Okay, but I'm not sure exactly what got me into that, but let's just take a look on page 70 and following, just to get some sort of a context for what comes up again indirectly in today's reading. He says in the third line on page 70, something is unusable. This means that the constitutive reference in the order to to a what for has been disturbed. The references themselves are not observed. Rather, they are there in our heedful adjustment to them, but in a disturbance of reference, in being unusable for. Oh, I know what got me onto Sartre. So all right, it's a little less sharply stated in Heidegger than it will be sharply stated by Sartre in Being and Nothingness, but the pour soi, right? The pour soi, the for itself. That's Sartre's version of the Heideggerian Dasein, which is that for the sake of which, and as he says, I think in today's reading, maybe not for the first time, but the first time I noticed him saying it explicitly, but we made reference to the radically self-referring structure of Dasein, right? So that, if Dasein is that for the sake of which, the ultimate, you want to close that circle, which is not a problem, as he points out to us, I think, again, in today's reading. if you want to close that circle, Dasein is the for the sake of which, and the for the sake of which it is the for the sake of which is itself. It is for the sake of itself. It is so Sartre kind of simplifies it, right? It's the pour soi, the for itself, as opposed to the in itself, right? Which is being, which for him is on the other side there, right? It's being is massive, and it's what's the word I'm looking for? It's completely dense. It's right. It's massive. It's completely impenetrable, right? And in Sartre, consciousness really, it's like skating. I mean, okay. It's a little different kind. It's like skating. I shouldn't do this, should I? I'm going to do it anyway. I just can't resist. So, you know what I'm going to do? Well, Heidegger is skimming along on the waters of ontology, right? But those waters have been frozen in Sartre, and he's skating on the waters of, right? But there's, and so to go back to something somebody said, I think it was you. Now he's really got a really hard pond, right? In other words, in Heidegger, the feet are getting wet, right? In other words, there's a certain penetration of the water, even though you're staying on the surface, right? You've got the skis or whatever your metaphor is, your jet ski or your your motorboat, however he's doing this. But nevertheless, you're somehow or a little bit in the water. There's a certain, right? There's a certain interpenetration, as it were, of the water in the boat up to a point. I don't want to get too physical about it, right? But you get whereas in Sartre, there's no penetration of being whatsoever by consciousness. Okay, so in a certain way, Heidegger is more hopeful, as it were, in a certain way, more hopeful, more expectant. You see, more in that sense, more historically oriented, perhaps, than we may understand. It's strange to say this. I don't know whether this is true, but I think it's true, and it's really paradoxical. Then a little more historically oriented than the Marxist Sartre was, right? Taking a little, right. I have to be careful here because there is a moment of conversion in Sartre, and there is a kind of resoluteness and a kind of act of courage by which one, despite the impenetrability of being, does one's best to give meaning to life. But there again, as I say that, to one's life, I guess you could say, and maybe in general. But as I say that, I think of another point that Heidegger makes in the text today, in today's reading, that meaning really, as it were, is on the side of Dasein, not on the side of being. It's not beings that have meaning, but it is the meaningful. Dasein is the meaningful being, as it were, of beings. Then go back to my notion of the godlike, subliminally so, granted, in Heidegger. But his modernity is that and that's also true in Sartre in his own way, right? Whatever the ultimate futility, whatever the ultimate loss of the meaning of my existence may be when I cease to be, and the meaning of my existence falls into the hands of others, for itself, whatever that is, as long as I am, some. Right? Then I think I give what meaning I can to my life. Right? So the giving of meaning is really a kind of an extension of what, not quite so pointedly, but in effect what Descartes is doing. Right? The giving. In other words, not, and therefore he also goes back. He goes back to so this is why we lose touch with the notion of creation ex nihilo in modern thought. We really do. You see, it becomes at best the notion, which is probably would help explain. I think I do this in Novitas Mundi, and probably I do it in the Heidegger chapter. I think I make the distinction between Heidegger's understanding of the relationship of nothing, of the world to nothing, and the distinction that Thomas makes: the world is created ex nihilo, meaning after nothing. But Thomas excludes any material. I mean, material in the logical and ontological sense. In other words, the world is not made out of nothing, that as if you would make a bunny out of chocolate, right? In other words, nothing has no logically material relationship to the world in Thomas. It's not reducible materially to nothing. Do you see? It just means for him simply, right? So it has. So in these terms, it has no Nichtsein, is that it? No non-being? Yeah. Okay. It has no. The world doesn't. The non-being of the world becomes theologically relevant to somebody like Calvin. Calvin in spades, right? The world for Calvin is nihil, right? So Heidegger didn't come out of nowhere, right? Modernity. It's only after you get. So what I was going to say was when Descartes. Notice. Okay. Here's the analogy I want to make. When I say that Aristotle's God, the particular agent that Aristotle's prime mover, even the prime mover, and the other particulars. See, he's the big particular. But they're all particular agents. He and they cause the way in which the world is, but not its being simply, I say. Okay? So the analog to giving what I want to say is shape to the word. So in other words, another way of putting this in terms that Thomas would understand is that the Aristotelian divine causes, or the big cause, are the cause of the being or the actuality or the form. Now, here's where this will help me make the point, because for Aristotle, these would be, again, depending on the context, interchangeable terms. Sometimes they're not the same, okay? But in this context, they would be the same. That is, form as opposed to matter is where I'm going, right? So the gods are pure forms, pure actualities. They can be forms and actualities without having to make a distinction between those two things, because they're not, by definition, they have no material element to them, okay? So in the case of the divine elements, form and essence need not be distinguished. Whereas I point out in Novitas Mundi, whenever you're talking about natural things, you need to distinguish between form and essence, precisely because material or physical entities, including the human being, is a composite substance for Aristotle, and therefore there's a formal element, the soul, over against the body, but the soul, as the form of a body, you see why it gets sticky? As the form of a body, can't account for itself in Aristotle's universe unless there is an essence, there is an unchanging divine thing, do you see? More fundamental than the soul qua form of the body, right? Which eternally bears it up, as it were, right? Okay, so now I want to come back back to Heidegger through Descartes. So when I look at Descartes, what I see in Descartes is that not only has he entered into, in effect, maybe he didn't intend it, entered into the space that has been opened up by cracking open the unmoved mover's impenetrability. Not only has he moved up and take residence in there, but in so doing, he has already eclipsed for himself. He has already put out of his ken in that very move, and this comes out in spades in Husserl. I make the comment that what we have in Husserl is the eclipse of the divine. I mean, technically, I don't know. We're not talking about his personal life, right? The phenomenology is the eclipse of the question of the divine. That eclipse has already been, and that's why he's doing Cartesian meditations. He's on the right track. I mean, or there's a continuity here. What I'm saying, Descartes has already ruled out the notion of the divine, not altogether, because he's got the natural light in which he thanks God and so forth and so on. But the God he's thinking of is the God in whose image he is, right? But one of the other key things in the meditations is that he bears the mark of the. He's the what is the word? Fabric. He's the fabric. He's the fabricated of the right. He's the artifice that the artificer, the creator, has made, and as the product of the artificer, he bears the stamp of the artificer, and that is the idea of God. So he, the disembodied soul, is the very. Not only has he actually plays with this in the meditations. In his consciousness, he has the idea of God, and his consciousness is the idea of God, and there need not be any distance between those two notions, the part and the whole, precisely because he's immaterial, right? It doesn't pertain. There's a certain God divine-like wholeness. But what I was really going to was, so that if I stop and think about it, and this is relevant to understanding perhaps what I just called attention to ahead of time out of context, but we may never actually get to that part of the text. So when Heidegger says today that meaning belongs to Dasein, not right. Dasein is the only meaning. The inner-worldly beings are unmeaningful, right? They're not meaningful beings. They're not full of meaning. Right? Dasein is full of meaning. That full of meaning goes back, I'm saying, ultimately, through Hegel, backwards through Kant, goes back to Descartes, because what Descartes is doing is, in effect, giving, in effect, now, I don't think he speaks exactly this way, but his project is to discover the intelligibility of the world, right? So analogously, and maybe literally, depending on how you use the term, he's giving meaning to the world. If there is any meaning to the world, Descartes has to find it within his own introspective analysis of the way in which he is and is not the cause of the ideas of, or idea of the world, it's very pluralized, that he has, and to the extent to which he is not the intelligible cause of any idea, then God must be the intelligible cause. So what I'm trying to get at is this, that the role of meaning on the side of, let's say from Descartes through Hegel, on the side of consciousness, and it resurfaces now in critique of Heidegger. See, Sartre's trying to get back, he's trying to retrieve something. And what he wants to retrieve is the meaningfulness, the meaning-making of consciousness. And what I'm saying is that the meaning-making of the modern consciousness is the analog of the particular agency of the gods, of the classical gods. Right? So giving shape, giving form, you see, giving intelligibility to the world, making sense of the world, is the modern analog of creating the way the world moves. Do you see? It's perhaps, but as I say that, I have to say it's a little bit more complicated because now we get a situation in which, thanks to Kant's severance of the noumenon and the phenomenon, and Kant telling us, again, we must have done this, I guess, in the Faith and Philosophy course, explicitly, although we probably mentioned it before, that we are the author or the creator of our own experience. So there you have a very explicit instance of what I'm talking about, right? So, but the refinement I want to put on the analogy between the ancient and the modern roles is that I want to say something like the radicality or the depth to which the modern stand-in for the divine causality, that is, modern consciousness, self-consciousness in all its many forms, Kant, Hegel, and so forth, or maybe even in its pre-consciousness, pre-ontological Dasein, being in the world dimension. The difference is that the difference between this and the ancient analog is the radicality with which meaning is given here. In other words, it's something has been taken over, something has been appropriated implicitly, if not explicitly, from the notion of creation ex nihilo, despite everything I've said. In other words, Aristotle's God gives shape to the world, but he doesn't do so as absolutely, as it were, right? So in other words, when I think of Thomas's notion of creation ex nihilo, yes, the difference is that the creator ex nihilo brings into being in one act both the matter and the form, and we're stressing that he brings into being the matter and the form, and therefore, right, it's not just a question of reshaping some eternally existing matter, but the other thing we need to stress simultaneously is that God brings into being the form, right? In other words, he for the first time, right, makes the world to be intelligible. Actually, more technically, and we touched on this in one of these courses, for Thomas, the divine knowing makes to be, right? In other words, we know things that already are, to say, whereas for Thomas, the act of knowledge of God, that is God's knowledge of the world, actually would apply to God himself, but God's knowledge of the world makes the world to be, right? So it's a reversal of, there's a causality there, a causality relationship, but it's a reverse causality when it comes to knowledge.
Don't you feel like Heidegger is struggling to get out of that exact, the remnant of either subjectivity or I think what you're connecting to creation ex nihilo, in the sense that being in the world has this circularity, that Dasein is not a kind of singular moment of a source point or creating that meaning, but the very extent to which Dasein is meaningful or has some relationship to meaning is because of the prior existence of the world, of worldliness. So life.
Right.
So I would say it feels to me that Heidegger has more of an analog to Aristotle, to the ancient, than to Descartes, because precisely there's something that precedes Dasein. Even though Dasein has this importance in self-referentiality, it's preceded by, and in that sense, it seems like that ancient world where whatever meaning is given to Dasein more than it's created by Dasein.
Right. Okay. Yes. And that leads me to add something to what I said that brought forth that objection, which I agree with. Okay. So when I was alluding to a kind of implicit bringing forth of something about the creation ex nihilo, even in this context, right? So first of all, in agreement with you, notice that in the meaning-giving, as it were, meaning-giving role that the cogito is in from the get-go, the cogito does not account for itself in Descartes. The res cogitans is already kind of, in Heideggerian terms, is a kind of thrownness. It's all right, and it's got these ideas, and it's not clear to it that it in fact is the core. In fact, it turns out one of the ideas it has, it is not the cause of, God is, right? That's a key in the third meditation, the proof of God. So in that sense, even in Descartes, what I'm saying, would be problematic. In other words, well, wait a minute, everything's made sense up until the point where you said that there's something about creation ex nihilo operating even in the modern analogy to the ancients, right? So now you forced me to think about, well, what is that? Well, it ain't the meaning-giving function. It's the will. It's the will, right? In other words, it's the resolve of Descartes. That he can take credit for, right? That's the point at which he starts from scratch, right? You see? Once he resolves to start over. Now he's not. Heidegger's not a Cartesian. In what sense he's not a Cartesian? You see? Well, he's not a Cartesian because he wants to get beyond. He is radical, right? He wants to get under not only the subject world polarity that's a given in the Meditations, but he also in today's reading is very explicit about wanting to get beyond or underneath willing, right? What this enterprise that he's doing is not a matter of willing. So in that sense, okay. So in that sense, I would add to my generalization that the element that is reminiscent of the notion of creation ex nihilo is the not always obvious but fundamental reality of the role of will as that in which modern self-consciousness is rooted from Descartes onward, okay? And therefore, we have, so I think how you phrase it, but so, yes, Heidegger would like somehow or other to get in some way back to, if not only back to, but maybe further back, that right? But at least back that way, and therefore, yes, he wants to get underneath, in my language, the role of will here as an appropriate way of understanding the way in which Dasein is in the world. And so the question now that this little discussion raised in my mind, which I don't have the immediate answer, but I'll be thinking about this, is he successful at precisely that point? Is he able to do that? And the latter Heidegger is so-called latter Heidegger, the Heidegger after the turn, whatever that might mean. I'm always suspicious of those turns because I think that the seeds of the so-called turn are here already. For example, probably in last time's assignment, I don't know whether I can get to it in the text, but I think I brushed on it in passing here toward the end of the last class, where he talks about Dasein as submitting to the world. Well, that submission of the world to Dasein, well, the whole idea, the fundamental move in Heidegger, which I think is not obscure, is when he defines logos, and again today when he defines speech. in both cases, he defines it as letting beings, the beings within the world, letting them be, letting them show themselves as they are. I think he even says in themselves, right? And we touched on this. So go back to your question about metaphysics. Just say, I think we pointed out last time, and he repeats it again in his own difficult way. But he's not, and this is his. The language is just impossible. As it were, pre-ontological understanding of what truth there is in Hegel. Namely, he's not going to allow for any Kantian-like distinction or division between substance, in the sense of noumenal substance, and phenomenon or phenomenal substance. There's got to be a substantial substance. I'm just making up the language here, and that substantial substance for Heidegger is the substance of being in the world. Okay, so he wants to overcome that any form of dualism, and in that way he's reminiscent in his deeply critical way. He's reminiscent of he's dependent on Hegel as far as that as it were synthetic aspect of his thought is. But what I was about to say was what triggered that was letting things be, as he says in today's assignment, letting things appear as they are in themselves, right? So he's imported, when he imports, as we were saying last time, the nothing into being in the world, when nothing is not something outside of the world, and therefore we have built in the ground for angst, and angst as really the ground of being in the world, the rootedness of being in the world in angst. When he imports the nothing in, he also imports the substance, right? So in other words, it's as if all of those neat lines of division, which ultimately have perdured only by overlooking being in the world, right? By passing over, I think is the way he likes to put it, by passing over what the structure of Dasein is being in the world, by passing over that, by that, in that sense, in my language, not that uncritically accepting the kind of objective presence that he understands to have been there in one form or another from Plato on. In not being maybe I've got the answer to my question to myself. Maybe in being unwilling, to be an uncritical observer of something objectively present, being unwilling to pass over, right? So, is he beyond, in the language of the thing I do in the ethics seminar? Is he beyond? Now here's the connection. I made these notes to myself. So they're probably in some margin somewhere. There's a problem in the ethics seminar. I mean, it's not a problem, but it is a problem. That is, if you look at it, you should have a little problem. You should say, wait a minute. If you read the description in the ethics seminar about doing the right thing, and the whole, and this one is, the ethics seminar is done over against the Badiou in particular, right? And so the notion is that the ethic of simplicity is such that it's out of bounds to be willing to do the right thing, but it's also maybe more obviously, you see, at first glance, in ethical terms, you might say if you're unwilling to do the right thing, you're obviously a bad guy. You're unwilling to do the right thing, right? But the ethics of simplicity is just up against the time, right? And it's saying, in effect, no. It's not just if you're unwilling to do something. If you're willing to do something, you're also a bad guy, because you're either doing it or you're not. So I changed from the tradition of benevolence to beneficence, right? From willing the good to doing the good. And willing the good and the thinking now occurring doesn't cut it. The problem that I'm pointing to on the ethic of simplicity little fourfold box there, in the second dimension, is that the theological analog is the third person of the Trinity, is the Holy Spirit, who, we have to admit, if we read our Augustine and take him as our classical authority on the nature of the Trinity, is the will in the divine Trinity, you see? So how is that? So there's the problem. You see what I'm saying? In other words, how can that be? That willing theological analog of the second dimension of the ethic of simplicity, which is the dimension, by the way, of discretion, the having the patience to see what's different, or I might have written to see what's new, to see, where the seeing is not just jump up and back down again. So when we talk about logos in Heidegger's understand the proper meaning of logos, if that's the right word, or of speech, as a letting things show themselves as they are in themselves. That's a kind of forbearance. That's a kind of Gelassenheit. That's a kind of patience. You see? And that's what's developed in the so-called later Heidegger. That's kind of, but that's already here. That's the point I wanted to make about that. But that's already here in submission to the world, in the whole notion. That's what got me on it, I think. And the whole notion of letting things show themselves as they are in themselves. That is not imposing upon things, right? So that Heidegger's into a kind of thoroughgoing, fundamentally ontological understanding of, put it real simple, in terms that relate to the ethics of simplicity, of patience. And our friend Agamben also, this issue comes up in Agamben in the morality seminar, which is a follow-on to the ethics seminar, where Agamben speaks of Gelassenheit as the patience, in effect, of the lovers, but that's a patience in the face of a kind of the oldest of the old, a kind of, I want to say, a kind of absurd, a kind of unintelligibility of being, a kind of meaninglessness, and so on. But in other words, one way or the other, patience is always at issue here, right? So it's interesting to me when I'm trying to deal with these guys, when I'm thinking that I had no choice, as it were, which is a good sign. I had no choice but to associate the patience of discretion in the second moment with the spirit, the Trinitarian spirit, who, whether I like it or not, is associated with will. Do you see? So patience takes a certain kind of will, but it's the kind of so how can there be a place? That's my problem. How can there be a place for, in other words, it doesn't cut it that it's the divine will. Well, maybe it does, right? But it's not an obvious solution to say, well, the analog is to the divine will. But then, now that I've said that, I'm going to correct myself. It does cut it. Now, speaking of Dante, speaking of Agamben, speaking of Dante, speaking of the divine will, when Virgil escorts Dante around the Inferno and Paradise, it's kind of like a broken record. Every time Virgil refers to God, he refers to him, I think this is, I don't know if it's exactly phrased this way, but the elements of this, my recollection of it, are going to be right. God for Virgil is he for whom what he wills and what he is able to do are identical. Do you see? So that Heidegger helps here, because this helps us understand. Helps us understand where Heidegger is coming from, explicitly or otherwise. Right? One of the points he makes and it's clearer, a little bit clearer in the German, and I can't remember the German phrase, but you might know it. It's not the Verstand idea, but it's the other word he uses for. It's the Kernen. Yeah, but it has he speaks of sein können.
To be able to.
Well, yes, but he uses it to, and it does, I think, mean this. One of the meanings of it is to understand. To understand something, he makes the point explicitly. I mean, he's not making the point etymologically, but then he uses a term that reinforces what he makes explicit in the text. That for him, and you can see here you can see why the pragmatists like him. All right, once you can penetrate his peculiar way of writing, I mean, which is a little foreign to an American pragmatist, right? But nevertheless, once you get to where Heidegger's at, you can see some really important connections, potential connections, because the pragmatism is all about what? The identification of thought and action, right? And the test for Peirce of a concept is what action does it lead to? And you could say, in the case of James, the concept is only its cash value. It's not what it leads to, possibly, but what it actually leads to for James, who is the particularist, right? And what I'm saying is that what Heidegger makes it clear explicitly in his text is that to understand is to be able to, and to be able to is to understand. In other words, these are just two different ways of, I want to say, understanding, right? But in other words, what he's emphasizing there, it's a dealing with, all right? Again, it's this dealing with, it's making use of, and it's this preconceptual understanding, right? So remember, he emphasizes on a number of levels that in order to go in quest of the meaning of being, we must have already some understanding of being, okay? Well, see, what he's really talking about here is that the understanding of being is we must already be able to deal with being or beings. You see, or able to deal. We're dealing with being. We're involved with being from the. I guess it's not fair to say from the get-go. We have to say from before the get-go, right? As if there is, in that sense, no get-go. Right? In that sense, there is no get-go. So
page 134. That's where it's the being able to.
Where does he score it?
Yeah, the last paragraph of page 1.
Speaking ontically?
Yeah.
To understand something to mean being able to handle a thing, right? Being up to it, being able to do something. And understanding as an existential, the thing we are able to do is not a what, but being as existing, okay? So I'm glad you pointed that, because so what we understand is existence, right? What we understand, and therefore, if you put that together, something he said last time, which he reiterates in today's reading, that for Dasein, the substance of Dasein is to exist. You see, and so again, we're not talking now in the mind. I say, by the way, go back to your first or second question. First question. I say in Novitas Mundi that there has been since Aristotle no true metaphysics, but I say no true metaphysics. The false metaphysics is the metaphysics that Heidegger wants to get, is announcing the end of, right? Is already beyond in some sense. So modernity is metaphysical, but it's falsely metaphysical if I compare it to Aristotle, right? It's kind of falsely in the sense of fictively. So I'm going to be neutral. I don't mean false is bad. I mean false may be bad, but it's a fiction. You see, it's a fabrication. It's in imitation of the fabricator, of the artificer. Right? It's in the image of God, right? And the thinking now occurring, therefore, you could say it's the fiction taken infinitely far. Do you see? But then that's the schema taken, to an absolutely impossible, inconceivable length, right? But that criticism is immediately challenged by the fact that there's nothing to compare the fictiveness of the thinking now occurring to. Thank God. And that's the clean break that omnipotence makes, see? Without which we couldn't be here. We couldn't be in this otherwise absolutely inconceivable situation. You see? Okay, I got ahead of myself, but to come back to what you're pointing to on 134, so not a what, so a what would be his shorthand on page 134 in the bottom paragraph, in the fourth line, not a what, but being as existing. So I was going to say a couple things there. So far from not understanding being, we understand being in Heidegger, right? The being of things. We understand that being qua existing. So we have a preconceptual understanding of being because the substance of our being is existence, right? Where existence is being in the world, and that's substantial I don't want to say real here because it's a technical thing, right? That is substantial. So we have a knowledge, think of Kant now and you see the point. We have a knowledge of substance. We have an understanding of substance, not, you say, where at the same time we're denying any kind of, what does he call it in Kantian language, any kind of pure intuition in today's, right? In other words, pure intuition, if pure intuition means something opposed to, you say, or something which is limited to an appearance as an object, as an appearing object, distinguished from a non-appearing noumenal substance. No. We have an understanding of substance in what otherwise might be misconstrued to be a Kantian world of appearance of time and space in our existence, in the temporality of our being in the world, and in the being and of the being in the world, and of the being of the world, right? And also in our making room, right, for things to be, in our making room, opening up, being the clearing, letting things be, all of that, right? In that. Well, if I borrow a term from one of his later works, which one you may know, I can't remember which one it was, where he speaks of the fourfold of the world, the mortals and immortals, and so forth.
It's the lecture, the meaning of metaphysics.
It's what?
The lectures on the meaning of metaphysics.
Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure of that, but anyway, there's a fourfolded and the fourfoldedness of the unity of things, right? And so all of these things are enfolded in this enfoldedness, is the way I want to put it here, in such a way that we don't have any of these sharp, objective-like lines of delineation that we would have in the uncritical, in the passing over of our pre-ontological experience. I guess you could say that because the ontology, the so-called fundamental ontology that he is articulating or in the process of trying to work out here, is in principle rooted in our ontic experience. It can't be separated from it, do you see? Then there's no way that it can be simply neat demarcations that we, right? So the difficulty we have in articulating it, which is the difficulty he had in articulating it, we just have it as much if not more, is a function of the fact that, not that it isn't in some sense ontology, being, but it's being that is never allowed to be or never thought to be disconnected from from the existential, right? From the existential experience or the ontic experience, right? And of course, the flip side of that is if there is no such artificial, uncritical separation, then not only do we have a simply neat ontology, you see, which doesn't really do justice to our phenomenal experience, but the flip side of that is that neither do we have any kind of simply unintelligible immediate experience. And Merleau-Ponty runs with this. Merleau-Ponty and his, whatever the heck the name of that one is.
Primacy of perception.
Yeah, the body. I mean, that's the heart of his analysis of how the body perceives, right? That it's always, he may actually, I can't remember, it's been a while since I looked at the text, but if he doesn't say it exactly this way, he might just as well have, that the body has always been, right, in the sense of, in a Heideggerian thrownness sense, it's already always giving meaning, right? So in that sense, there's nothing for Merleau-Ponty. There's nothing that is simply meaningless, right? There's another connection. So he also shows another deep connection between the Persian idea that there's a continuity all the way back. Every thought has a preceding thought. So these guys they're at least in the same ballpark. I mean, they're on slightly different wavelengths, right? But there is this, and again, it's the continuing continuing relevance in other ways of what I'm saying critically. I'm saying in a critical way. I'm saying by way of criticism, but nevertheless, to understand them, it's a continuing evidence of the role of continuity here. Right. So one of the things you can say about creation ex nihilo as a starting place, which is as it were abandoned in de facto in Descartes, is that creation ex nihilo see, it's really not rooting the world. But if it were rooting the world, which is a contradiction in terms now, it's rooting the world in continuity. I mean, in discontinuity. I'm sorry, pardon me. In discontinuity, do you see? But of course, it's totally inappropriate to say rooting the world in discontinuity. And if you can't root the world in discontinuity, but discontinuity is that without which I can't properly understand whatever continuity there seems to be, right? If I can't root the world or my experience in discontinuity, then, and discontinuity, so to speak, is where it's at, then there is no rootedness. But if there's no rootedness, there's no depth. There is this absolute superficiality, which the thinking now occurring is talking about, right? This absolute immediacy, which therefore is not meaningful anymore, because meaning is a kind of distancing idea. What is meant, right? The project idea, which he uses a lot in understanding Dasein. Dasein is projecting toward its possibilities of being, or more precisely, its possibility or possibilities of being itself, or its potentiality to be itself, and then that can be subdivided into authentic and inauthentic, and that further can be subdivided, as you picked up today, into genuine and ungenuine. So you can be genuinely and ungenuinely inauthentic, and you can be ungenuine. Is that the right word? No, it's ungenuine. I think ungenuinely unauthentic and genuinely unauthentic. So that's another thing. I have a marginal note which we may never get to. But so the point I want to make there is to call your attention to the fact that authenticity here, even though I was tempted the other day to use colloquially the word genuine, doesn't mean the same thing, right? It emphasizes that what authenticity has to do with is owning. It's the I-ness idea, right? That or appropriation, whatever you want. So it's one thing to say that something is appropriated and something is not appropriated, but then you can appropriate it genuinely and ungenuinely if you want. So anyway, the point really being that the point I want to make is that the notion of authenticity is very much rooted, and in Heidegger I think you can say this because he speaks this way, rooted in the notion that Dasein is ultimately that which is for the sake of itself. The constitutional structure of Dasein is self-referring, okay? And so that own-most language is right at the heart of what we're talking about. And if there's a paradox, then if we go back to the other larger notion in Heidegger, that his critique is that passing over of our, I think we hit on it last time on page 99, the actual world, the world of our actual experience, we might say, the passing over of it in traditional, in the philosophy, in the history of philosophy, up until it came to an end, so to speak. The passing over of our actual phenomenal experience, if you want, our pre-ontological experience, our actual pre-ontological experience, is the equivalent of not rooting, philosophy is not rooting its ontology, first its metaphysics in the true sense of the word, and then in its false sense of the word, its modern metaphysics, but nevertheless, it's in both cases, its ontology, not rooting it in its ontic experience of the world. And I've just said the flip side of that is that it fails, therefore, to appreciate that in its preconceptual being, Dasein, is already, I want to say, in the business of, it's probably the wrong term, is already engaged in giving meaning to the world, right? So there's a kind of a preconceptual meaning to the world, preconceptual understanding of the world, conceived to be objectively present. That's what he immediately means, okay? But I'm saying the larger picture is that the thing objectively present, he elsewhere, in effect, if sometimes more or less explicitly, he effectively derives that notion from the Platonic idea and its form as the Aristotelian essence, which I was touching on in another context earlier on, right? So the objective presence of the things of the world in modern consciousness is a derivative of an uncritical notion of essence that goes back to the ancient world. And here, I'm going to go back to your objection to my answer to it. I want to compound the difficulty here a little bit by saying that when he says that the essence of Dasein is to exist, as I think I said in a different context last time, that reminds me of Thomas, in effect, saying that the essence, the essay, okay, but the essence of God is essay, the act of being, to be, right, in the verbal sense of the word, right? And I point out it's not exactly the same thing as to say the essence is to exist, but it is the analog in Heidegger, do you see, of, and in that sense, indirectly, it is a kind of carryover, right? Oh, and I'm sorry. You have to understand that following what I'm saying is not just trying to follow me around the circle, but it's like the molecule, with the 8 or 9 circles going into the penetrating, okay? Now, if I can remember I get hung up in these metaphors. It's not funny. The essay. Okay, so the essence of God for Thomas is essay. The essence of Dasein is existence. There's a transformation there. Essay, it would not be unqualifiedly existence in this sense. Although we have because of the role of the. So I understand how essay became in effect existentia in an effectively interchangeable way, or forget interchangeable. It becomes in effect the substitute for it, right? You have to go back to the notion of incarnation. I was going to say something with reference to the morality seminar, and I can't remember what it was, so it may come back in my mind. All right. All right. Well, there's the circle on page 143. I don't think we're going to go backwards at this point. And this circle comes up again in today's reading in a slightly different context.
We're in today's reading. Thank you.
You're asking me, right? Because you remember these pages. I don't. I have to write them down.
We are. 134 to 201.
Oh, where are we now, you mean? Or what are you asking me? Right now, what am I pointing to in the text? 143.
Right, which is in today's reading.
No. Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe that's what I was thinking of. But then it comes up earlier. Okay. Well, let's just take a look at that because I think, and also it follows on the notion of meaning. What he's discussing here in general in this passage, in this section, is the notion of meaning. And let's, at the bottom of page 142, he says, as the disclosedness of the there, understanding always concerns the whole of being in the world. In every understanding of world, existence, this I think really is the answer to your question in the text, right? In every understanding of world, existence is also understood and vice versa, right? Furthermore, every interpretation operates within the force structure which we have characterized. Every interpretation which is to contribute some understanding must already have understood what is to be interpreted, which is a very old paradox that goes right back to Aristotle, right? It's Aristotle's... Now, of course, it goes back to Plato, because it was Plato who set this up in a less satisfying way, a simpler way, but a less satisfying way from Aristotle's point of view. Plato's version of this which is operating in the conflation of Socrates and Plato in Kierkegaard's philosophical fragments, Plato's version of this deep reality of understanding, which is first articulated in a way strictly analogous to this by Aristotle. Plato's version of it, a little more simple-minded version of it, is Plato's notion of anamnesis, that we learn, or we come to understand the Pythagorean theorem, for Plato, because we eternally have known it and knew it before we entered into the cave of the body. All right. So that's a very. You see what I'm saying? It's very. You see what was bothering Aristotle. That Plato's a genius. I mean, he's a genius. I'm going to take nothing away from him. Okay. But it's kind of childlike view of the problem, right? But it has a certain simplicity. But Aristotle wanted to complicate the matter, and he wanted to internalize. In other words, you see, he wanted to do his own Heidegger on the tradition. So he wanted to internalize this problem, and therefore, yes, we do know ahead of time in some way what we come to know, but in another way. That's an oversimplification, but that's Aristotle's solution. And Heidegger is doing his version of that, only he's doing it now in an altogether altogether, both modern and ancient, non-metaphysical context, and in the context of the notion of meaning or intelligibility or understanding, which is therefore also, how I want to put it, pre-epistemological, if epistemology is a compartment of a traditional, metaphysically oriented philosophizing, or a philosophizing that is metaphysical, and epistemology is part and parcel of that, and the problems of epistemology are part and parcel of that, then we're going to restate those problems in a non-metaphysical, non-epistemological way, but we can notice the echo, the resonance of this description with the meta. So, and I think he says it in today's reading. I'm sure he says it. Every once in a while, after he's doing these critiques of Descartes and Kant and so forth, he puts in a little paragraph saying, well, it's not altogether, what they're saying is not altogether wrong, right? But it has to be grounded in something more primordial. That's what he's saying. Right? So he's accepting a lot, and he's quite consistently, therefore, using a lot in a more primordial context. So every interpretation which is to contribute some understanding must already have understood what is to be interpreted. And so that's where the issue of the circle arises. And he makes note of the fact that on page 143, about 6 or 7 lines down, according to the most elementary rules of logic, the circle is a circulus viciosus, a vicious circle. But in the next paragraph, but to see a vitiosum in this circle and to look for ways to avoid it, even to feel that it is an inevitable imperfection, is to misunderstand understanding from the ground up. All right, and he has made an analogous point, I think, in one of the earlier readings. That's why I thought this was one of those readings. He says, dropping down maybe 8 or 9 lines into that paragraph to the sentence, "What is decisive is not to get out of the circle, but to get in it in the right way." I have a correspondent. I don't know. I don't think anybody. I haven't inflicted the copies of this recently on you. You may have a copy of this answer to Foldus.
Yes.
I have this. Did you see that? Well, I have this Ken Foldus, who's a contemporary thinker of some sort. He's paradoxically, I mean, I think it's an impossible paradox, but he presumably is both Catholic and Hegelian, which I think that's a contradiction in terms. But in any event, the point is he wanted to assimilate the thinking now occurring, as people would like to do. This is not limited to thinking now occurring. Whenever you come up with something that people have never heard before, the first thing you want to do is they want to, so-and-so said that, right? Okay, because that makes you feel comfortable. You don't want to be, completely uprooted. So Foldus, who's a deep Hegelian, that he certainly is, wants to see that the thinking now occurring is really saying the same thing. It's a semantic problem. Really saying the same thing as Hegel. And now another way of my speaking of the absolute superficiality of reality. Pardon me, don't listen. The absolute superficiality of reality in the thinking now occurring is such that, another way of putting that is this absolute outside, or as I say in terms of the geometry of the absolute dead center cube in the middle of foundation there, that cube, despite its first glance appearance, is absolutely one-sided, as is proven when it's absolutely, speaking of transparency, it's absolute transparency. But that absolute transparency is an absolute simplicity in the way in which the simplicity that is in the transparency of Heidegger, it's not an absolute simplicity. All right, it's that kind of difference. Or where he's doing fundamental ontology, no problem. He is doing fundamental ontology in the sense in which he means to do it. But what he is not doing is absolute ontology. Do you see?
Why is the transparency not simple in Heidegger? What's the complexity? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's... Okay, this will go back to my point on wholeness, which I'm reminded of here in Heidegger's making the point. So Heidegger and I use the same tactic in a different context, right? He's saying the problem is not that there's a circle, but it's the question of the right way to get into the circle, which reminds me of what we were saying about Descartes. See, that circle is the divine in Descartes, or in Hegel. That circle is a sphere, it's three-dimensional. And it's the divine mind, okay? And Descartes entered into it, and I guess you could say Hegel followed him, on a larger scale, right, into that circle. But he's saying here, that's not the problem. It's the right way of getting into the circle. But I want to go back to my point about thinking now occurring because it gives a general context for the approach to Heidegger here. So Foldis says to me something like, oh, I know. So I'm objecting, they're not the same. And he comes back with the notion that, well, come to think of it, even though he is a good Hegelian, he's not sure that Hegel and I aren't making the same mistake. Okay? So Foldis want to occupy, he's looking for a third position here. And he says, well, Hegel is perhaps one-sided, because I'm saying, it's absolute self-consciousness, which is not an obscure notion. So Foldis says, well, Hegel is one-sidedly self-consciousness. And it seems that maybe you're one-sidedly other consciousness. And Foldis says, in effect, he would prefer something like other self-consciousness. So at which point it was great for me to be able to say, oh, well, if that's what you're looking for, try American pragmatism, because that's exactly what Peirce is. Do you see? It's exactly the introduction into what otherwise would be the one-sidedly or absolute self-consciousness of Hegel. Introduction into it, pragmatism is the introduction into it of an irreducible otherness, an irreducible real that the mind cannot simply reduce to itself. So that enabled me to say, now here's what I like to be able to say, reminded me of Heidegger. It enabled me to say to Foldis, so the problem with Hegel is not that he's one-sided, but that he is only relatively one-sided, do you see? Because his one-sided self-consciousness is opposed to another which he has to reduce to himself. In other words, he's not absolutely one-sided as you would be if there's no self-other relationship to begin with, right? So the thinking now occurring is an absolutely one-sided consciousness, or an absolutely other consciousness would be a more precise way. I want to say how absolutely forget the consciousness part. The thinking now occurring is a thinking which is an absolutely one-sided thinking. That'd be more technically correct. The thinking now occurring is a thinking which is absolutely one-sided thinking, and the problem with Hegel is not that he is one-sided, but that he is not absolutely so. The analog to that I've already mentioned to you in my reading of Heidegger, that the problem with Heidegger is not that he's doing ontology, but that he's doing only fundamental ontology. He's not doing absolute ontology. And that limitation, vis-a-vis the thinking now occurring as absolute ontology, that limitation surfaces, as it were, comes up, surfaces, but not absolutely so, if you want to put it. It surfaces in the important role that the nothing has in the world. That Dasein is the being in. Right? So where there's absolutely no nothing, there's no nothing whatsoever, however you want to phrase it, there is no nothing, then you have absolute personhood, then you have absolute particularity, absolute specificity, you have absolutely and essentially one-sided thinking, if you want to put it that way. And yet there's an empathy for Heidegger, because his only problem, so to speak, in the context of the thinking now occurring, is that he is going in this direction. He is anticipating what cannot be as such anticipated. He's anticipating it, right? And that's why there's a certain muteness and a certain, ultimately, as he goes on, it becomes, in a certain sense, the silence trumps the speech. The waiting trumps the positive articulation, because that is really the only truthful way. I mean, really the truthful way is really would be the extreme of waiting, of the extreme of letting it happen, of letting it be, do you see? But as long as my role is, it's like the stretching out, right? I want to say the attenuating, the kind of perfect attenuation of the waiting, of the letting be, right? The kind of expanse of silence, do you see? Well, what could end that? And maybe you could say, well, that's okay. There's a certain honesty, and I was reading somebody on the later Heidegger, a certain humility in not going further, right? But then if the thinking now occurring, so that fits, because the thinking now occurring doesn't pretend to be anything but productive receptivity, right? In other words, it takes with utter seriousness the notion that omnipotence makes a clean break and sets the creation and the creature in a place which is absolute freedom, and therefore, ultimately, Heidegger, in a certain sense, is not wrong. In other words, the thinking now occurring doesn't understand itself to be as absolute other consciousness. It could not anything of its own doing, but absolutely not its own doing.
Yeah, I mean, Heidegger says we have to wait, and the only thing to wait for would be for a God.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, he speaks of the last God. We'll have to look at that when we get to that. Okay. So this circle, to get back to the point here, in the first paragraph beginning in 143, to see a vitiosum, a viciousness in this, something vicious in this circle, and to look for ways to avoid it, even to feel that it is an inevitable imperfection, is to understanding from the ground up. Dropping down about 8 or 9 lines, what is decisive is not to get out of the circle, but to get into it the right way. This circle of understanding is not a circle in which any random kind of knowledge operates, but it is rather the expression of the existential force structure of Dasein itself. The circle, so another way of putting this is, now this is, I want to just make the analogy, I don't want to make it too strong, because I don't want to override the sense Heidegger's, what I want to call his phenomenological sensibility, which is not a bad choice of words as I think about it. But notice here, this is something analogous to the Hegelian idea of absolute self-knowledge, right? In other words, the self-containedness of the absolute idea in Hegel is, yes, the coming to absolute self-knowledge is the working out within the absolute idea, in time and space, of a knowledge of itself, which is, in some sense, already there in Hegel, in the Hegelian ontology of metaphysics. And analogously now, the Dasein here, the circle of the understanding of Dasein, has to do with the force structure of Dasein itself. The circle must not be degraded to something vicious, not even to a tolerated one. A positive possibility of the most primordial knowledge is hidden in it, which, however, is only grasped in a genuine way when interpretation has understood that its first, constant, and last task is not to let forehaving, foresight, and foreconception be given to it by chance ideas and popular conceptions, but to guarantee the scientific theme by developing these in terms of the things themselves. Right? So the force structure, the ultimate structure, is there in the form of a force structure, or the ultimate conception of Dasein's, the ultimate understanding, to speak comprehensively, of Dasein's existence is there in the form of a fore-understanding, a fore structure, a fore-having, a fore-knowing, any number of different ways he might put it. And that's And so I want to say, well, wait a minute. Now the circle is also an important role in the thinking now occurring. And every time I talk about the thinking now occurring circle, I keep saying that the circle is composed of disconnected, discontinuous dots. It's a circle sans the continuity. And I was saying last time, geometric analog to the introduction of the non-Levinasian move of Heidegger, the move of Heidegger backwards from the uncritical history of philosophy is not as radical as Levinas. Levinas goes back to the starting point, which is nothing, and goes past it, goes back beyond the center of the circle, as it were. And I said, speaking analogously or imagistically, geometrically, that Heidegger might be understood to go back to that nothing, but not to go past it. And by going back to that nothing, he in effect incorporates it, brings it to the fore, its role to the fore as central to, as fundamental to as fundamental to ontology, or as fundamental to being. And so being now becomes crossed out being, or being, right? You see, the being nothing thing is not just negatively indeterminate, as it is in Hegel, negatively indeterminate, but we could say that what in Hegel would be negatively indeterminate is, as it were, positively indeterminate in Hegel. And that's what I mean in Heidegger. And that's what I was saying when I said that if I look at it in terms of the logical dialectic of Hegel, we don't get past square one in Heidegger. We don't get past that point at which being and nothing have not yet been determined vis-a-vis one another, when they're indistinguishable. We don't get past that. And I was using the geometrical analogy that once my attention is drawn to that the center of this whole circle is zero dimensionality. It is not being, right? It is no thing, no what, do you see? But that it's an integral part of my pre-ontological experience of the world in that uncritical sense of the word ontology. Then I said, if I stop and think about it, every point on that continuous circle, of which this is the center, taken in isolation would be, in this context, it would be nothing too. And every space on the plane of the circle would be, every point on that space would be nothing. Nothingness would be, as it were, all pervasive here. You see? And today, in today's assignment, if I don't get to it, I think I will. But if I don't, by any chance, you could not, I hope, have missed him saying, within the space of 2 sentences, talking about being in the world as being in nothing, in the nothing. He equates the world at a certain point in today's text with nothing. Do you see? Now, of course, it's not that simple, because in that same section, he's going to say, well, wait a minute, nothing doesn't mean, how does he put it? He says something to the effect. Maybe he says non-being doesn't mean simply nothing. He says it means something. That's the whole point. In other words, the something, which is not a what, which is not a construct of an uncritically, a philosophy is uncritically taken up with objective presence, that is passing over the ontic experience of the world, the pre-ontological experience of the world that is being in the world, which in the passing over of which thinking has failed hitherto to understand that pre-ontological being in the world is nevertheless not something in which I want to say an authentic ontology is not something in which an authentic ontology cannot be rooted. Okay, that's tough, but you got this. I think I said it right. All right. So, in other words, the passing over, the uncritical acceptance of a neatly structured ontology. That's a high class version of what he elsewhere talks about as being the temptation to be absorbed in the world. In other words, it's a kind of the philosophical version of a kind of pedestrian being lost in the day. Because what is all that ontology? It may not be eternal in the Platonic Aristotelian sense, but what all those forms, insofar as they were not invented by the Cartesian cogito, by the all those ideas, even the Kantian ideas, even though they don't necessarily refer to any substance, right? Nevertheless, they were not brought into being ex nihilo by the Kantian human collective subjectivity. So they are effectively, they are formally, all of that ontology, godless or otherwise, you see, is divine. It's all, I mean, divine in the sense of eternal. Do you see? It's all static. And what is what is his critique of the subjectivity of the they? Right? Everything is accepted as obviously the case, as self-evidently the case, as effectively as if it's always been the case. It's as if it had no beginning or origin. Right? You see, as if it were. Now here's another use of the word: as if it were simply there. Okay, so the complication of things here. Pick up the train of my thought with the. Well, I got a couple of things with the circle, but what was it? I'll get back to the. Oh, the fork. This understanding that being in the world already is of its own existence has been passed over. And in being passed over, it's been passed over in favor of, right, what I was calling a neat ontology of what are effectively eternal forms, do you see, that in one way or another then have to be, and this is the point he makes in today's reading, then have to be brought together, joined together with a material element, with some sort of sensibility. Do you see? In Kant, for example, with sensible intuition, conceptual understanding is joined together, and it's the synthesis in Kant, a synthesis which is not radical enough for Hegel, right? But to the extent to which logically he makes such a synthesis, the unifying moment in Kant, the moment of judgment, is the synthesis of concept and sensibility. But the original uncritically accepted move is the division of the two. And again, it's an echo of Hegel in a Heideggerian mode. Okay, so in getting into this, in focusing on the fore understanding, or the understanding that Dasein already has, pre-ontological understanding of being in the world, however you want to phrase it, or a pre-ontological understanding of being, or which makes possible the inquiry into the meaning of being. All of that is setting aside, at least as it. Well, it's setting aside. I think it's setting aside. It's being out from under, or it's being under in the way of being out from under the uncritical need ontology, which, as I say, is the flip side of a kind of meaningless ontic world, of a meaningless immediate experience. And it's denying both of those simultaneously in its own synthetic manner, right? And therefore there is in this sense of the word, a pre-conceptual objectivity. There is a pre-conceptual understanding of being by being that's intrinsic, that's intrinsic to being in the world. Okay, so to come back to the circle question, it's so a positive possibility of the all right. Oh, and so the I don't know whether given this is the right word here. The understanding already is connected with the notion of possibility. So possibility plays an important role in Heidegger in a number of ways, right? But it's what Dasein's concern for the being that is its being itself is a concern for the possibility of its being itself, and the role of possibility is both future oriented and it's future oriented, but the future in turn is related to a fundamental pastness, right? Which helps us explain the thrownness part, right? As it were, the backward valence of being in the world, right? The being already in the world, being in the world. Yeah.
Isn't this kind of where we see most clearly how this is not thinking about creation ex nihilo? I mean,
Yeah.
There's always the for structure, and if it's
Right.
about possibility, which has already been there.
Positive possibility, the most primordial knowledge, is hidden in it, right? And that knowledge, of course, is going to be by reference to Hegel, self-knowledge. It's going to be self-knowledge on the part of a Dasein now, not on the part of a consciousness as such, but on the part of the being there. It will be self-knowledge. Yes, and in that sense, I said that Leibniz, on the level of what's, on the level of essences, Leibniz talks about possible what's. You say, I guess Heidegger's answer to that is pretty simple. Just as it's a mistake to think that inner worldly beings have meaning. It's a mistake to think, because Dasein is meaningful, right? Meaning is for Dasein, or is what Dasein does. But it's also a mistake to think that inner worldly beings have possibility. Possibility belongs to Dasein. Do you see? And therefore, the world, the inner worldly things of the world are not that for the sake of which. Do you see? They are for the sake of Dasein. They are for the sake, in Sartre, in terms of the poor itself. I never did fully articulate that in one simple sentence. For Sartre's simplification of this particular issue is that the poor itself is an instrument that handles itself, and the world, which is effectively its identity in Sartre, right, is a complex of instrumentality. Well, he's just saying in slightly different language what Heidegger has first articulated, right? That the things of the world are understood by Dasein in terms of their relevance to Dasein's being itself, in terms of their usability. Their usability is a function of, places them in a hierarchy of relatedness and reference and relevance and so forth and so on. All right. Only grasped in a genuine way when interpretation is understood that its first, constant, and last test to let forehaving, foresight, foreconception is not to let it be given by chance, ideas, and popular conceptions, but to guarantee the scientific theme by developing these in terms of the things themselves. Because in accordance with its existential meaning, understanding is the potentiality for being of Dasein itself. The ontological presuppositions of historiographical knowledge transcend in principle the idea of rigor of the most exact sciences. Mathematics is not more exact than historiographical, but only narrower with regard to the scope of the existential foundations relevant to it. The circle in understanding belongs to the structure of meaning, and this phenomenon is rooted in the existential constitution of Dasein, in interpretive understanding. Beings which, as being in the world, are concerned about their being itself, have an ontological structure of the circle. I think we should, because it'll take up the question of mood in the most concrete sense, we should probably find our angst issue here. Well, actually, on the way to that, I think it comes later. On the way to that, not unrelated to it, in fact, deeply related to it, on page 164. Falling prey and thrownness. He says in the second paragraph of that section 38, this term, which does not express, that is, entanglement of Dasein. And we've already touched on the earlier passages on the notion that Dasein is entangled in the tradition. So that's a kind of, in Heideggerian terms, a kind of a historical reference, right? But so in my language, just metaphorically, that's a kind of horizontal way of looking at it, the entanglement. Looking at it vertically, like it's in the here and now, as it were, the entanglement is going both vertically and horizontally. So I think the thrust here is not so much historical, but existential in the sense in which we would normally understand it. This term, which does not express any negative value judgment, means that Dasein is initially and for the most part together with the world that it takes care of. This absorption in mostly has the character of being lost in the publicness of the they. As an authentic potentiality for being itself, Dasein has initially always already fallen away from itself and fallen prey to the world. So again, this is not an accidental condition, right? This is part of the authenticity of Dasein, to be lost in the they, to be absorbed in the world. Falling prey to the world means being absorbed in the being with one another as it is guided by idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity. What we call the inauthenticity of Dasein may now be defined more precisely through the interpretation of falling prey. But inauthentic and unauthentic by no means signify not really, as if Dasein utterly lost its being in this kind of being. Right? Inauthenticity does not mean anything like no longer being in the world, but rather it constitutes precisely a distinctive kind of being in the world, which is completely taken in by the world, and the Dasein of the others in the they. Not being itself functions as a positive possibility of beings which are absorbed in a world, essentially taking care of that world. This non-being must be conceived as the kind of being of Dasein nearest to it and in which it mostly maintains itself. Right? So again, I made reference to Hegel, and I made reference to Heidegger. One way of understanding Heidegger is that he doesn't get beyond, he doesn't try to get beyond, it doesn't occur to him to get beyond. It occurs to him precisely not to get beyond the first Hegelian moment in which being and nothing are otherwise indistinguishable or indeterminate. So to get beyond the whole notion, the whole modern metaphysical notion of the determination of being, you see, and instead of determining being, let being be, you see, and so the letting be of being in the way in which Heidegger reads logos and speech, the understanding of being that is does not pass over being in the world. Has to it as I want to say, the nearest of the near, to speak a little poetically, nothing. In other words, non-being is how does he put it? He doesn't say, well, he doesn't say the nearest of the near, maybe that's too poetic, but I think that's the thrust where he's going, right? It's nearest to Dasein, nearest to it, and in which it mostly maintains itself. So the nothing is certainly nothing outside the world, you see, but it is nearest to being in the world, right? As factical being in the world, Dasein falling prey has already fallen away from itself, and it has not fallen prey to some being which it first runs into in the course of its being, or perhaps does not, but has fallen prey to the world which itself belongs to its being. All right, and that world, of course, he's going to elsewhere refer to, as I've already anticipated. The world itself, in some sense, can be equated with nothing. All right.
I'm not getting that. I just want to at least flag.
Which
me.
What I just said now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Overall,
Okay.
like as a general comment, I'm not understanding from the perspective of the TNO. I'm not understanding why the nothing seems so important for Heidegger, because I
Okay.
get so much something with him and not so much nothing.
Yeah, but okay. I don't know. I'm afraid to.
Okay.
I'm going to get to it. I have it on my agenda. I have it right in front of me. I have my finger on it. So I want to come to the particular passage that I'm referring to.
Please.
Let me just see if I can get us out of this page. It's fallen away from itself, all right? So in other words, I think he said earlier in the earlier chapter section we read last time, I think we noted that what Dasein fears is itself, okay? So it's, you might say, if this were an ethical treatise, or if this had any kind of, made any value judgments, which it doesn't. He tells us that a couple times, right? So it's not just you who notice that. He deliberately doesn't mean to do so, right? But you could say, it's an interesting analog, both theological and ethical, that Dasein's falling away from itself is not exactly innocent. See? I mean, I think of the bad faith that becomes central in Sartre's analysis of the for itself, right? Bad faith is by no means simply lying to oneself, right? Nor is it radical part of the for itself, of consciousness, right? And that's so true that Sartre makes the point that sincerity is bad faith, right? In other words, what Sartre gets out of Heidegger, and helps us illuminate Heidegger's text here, is that yes, Hegel is right that I can't separate in what Leahy's referring to as the first Hegelian moment before I get to the determination. You see, that's where he's at. He refuses to go the route of objective presence. He's not going to go to determination of being. He's going to stay with what otherwise in Hegel would be a being which is indistinguishable from nothing, but he's not going to allow that because there's no determination of being, no hasty reduction of being to being present objectively. He's not going to allow that because that is the case, because there's no determination, that there's no way of understanding a relation of nothing and being. And so he uses the word here, nearest, right? There is some kind of proximity. There's something, I want to get the idea, I want to just import here, and we can throw it out right away. But maybe you shouldn't. There's a kind of a neighboring relationship between being and nothing here. Very close neighbors, right? It's the nearest neighbor to being is, right? So it's not that I can't, right? So that leaves, so then I've introduced right here at this point, so I don't have to wait till the second and third Hegelian moments to get to the notion of the fall. I don't have to, and I can borrow something from Heidegger, from Kierkegaard, which of course Altizer says that he steals a lot from Kierkegaard, right? But he existentializes it with the AL in a way that distinction has not been made and can't be made in the absurd place that Kierkegaard remains in. So it's not. I mean, yes, he takes a lot from, but the original way in which he employs it. But what I was going to say was, if you read, you get the very offensive notion in Kierkegaard's reading that to exist is to fall, is to be fallen. Right? In other words, and that's really pushing it. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay,
That's what I'm saying. So we have the echo in this proximity of we don't have an absolute nothing, a sheer simple nothing. I think it's what Heidegger wants to say. The non-being that we have here is not simply nothing, but it's something. But the flip side of that is that something that it is nothing, but it's not determinately nothing, because if it were determinately nothing, we wouldn't be so damn anxious. Understand? So the fact that it's not determinately nothing, this something, this being, and it's really nice choice of language, because if you read Faith and Philosophy carefully, I really focus on Descartes' modest decision that he can't deny that. Well, he doesn't know what the hell he is. He doesn't know what. He doesn't know what he is, but he knows he's something. Aliquid, right? Non nihil. That's all he says. All right. So but Hegel is very impatient with a guy like Descartes for precisely that reason. Right? What do you mean something, and you're not a what? You haven't gotten to the moment of essence, and you just say you don't know what you are, and yet you tell Hegel, I can't. What you call a something, I can't. It's as far as I'm concerned, it's just nothing. Period. I'm Hegel. You see, and Descartes is not going to do that. So there's a sense in which there is a kind of retrieval here on another level, of course, post-Hegelian level of something that is true in some important way in Descartes. Okay, so yes, so now I have a being and nothing, or what otherwise would be an indeterminate relationship between being and nothing, which I just have to call a kind of nearness of nothing to being, or I have a something which cannot be determinately or simply dissociated with nothing, and therefore analogously, and see the pragmatists here, they're waiting, they're listening to this, and nor do I have a nothing that can be simply determined not to be something. I can't do that. So there's Peirce's pragmatic version of this, is that there is an insensible merging of being and nothing. Now he's speaking a little bit too metaphysically in a Heideggerian context, I suppose you might say. But nevertheless, at that point there's a point of contact. Okay. All right. So so what I'm getting at is so instead of, I guess, so a function of the nearness. That's what it is. All right. So I'm saying it isn't a relationship between being and nothing it isn't in the category of determination or indetermination. So it's in the category of near and far. It's in the but that is not, as he has told us in many. When we talk about near and far, when I walk down the road today, it's the same road, it's the same number of miles, but it's much longer than it was yesterday, right? And for him, that's not a subjective as opposed to an objective determination of being, in which case it would be false. But it is. I think we could venture here authentic. It's certainly genuine understanding of being in a pre-conceptual, pre-ontological objectivity, or however I was phrasing it the other day. So what I'm getting at is, so falling. What is falling? Falling is the
Falling away from Dasein.
well, it's the falling away from Dasein. So it's not something you're going to measure with a yardstick. How far did you fall? It's not the point in those. In terms of what I'm calling this precise demarcation, right? But the falling is much more fundamentally rooted in precisely in the being underneath or beyond or before, probably before. I think it's the way he's really thinking about in the fore understanding, right? That fore understanding is rooted in the falling prey, which is constitutionally, authentically where Dasein is, or where the being that is there is, something to that effect.
Is authentic Dasein fallen, or has
Yeah,
authentic?
yeah, he said that on that over on page 164 in the beginning of the second paragraph of 38. As an authentic potentiality of being a self, Dasein has initially already fallen away from itself and fallen prey to the world.
It's the initial condition of being born into a thrown world, or being
Right.
thrown
Yes.
into a world, or
Right. Yeah. Right. Of being already in the world. Well, you could parse it out a little bit. Dasein is thrown. It's already in the world, and its authentic way of being in the world, in which it already is in falling prey to the world. So there's nothing, in other words, authentic here meaning there's nothing that contradicts the kind of what I want to call pre-consciousness selfhood of Dasein. Right? There's nothing that contradicts that self that Dasein is, even if it's not self-consciousness. The selfhood of Dasein is not contradicted by its not only by its already being in the world, not at all, and certainly not, more particularly not, contradicted by its being in the way of being fallen or having fallen prey to the world, being absorbed in the world. In the Heideggerian sense, you could say thoughtlessly. And one of the this brings it all together. So one of the thoughtless ways of being in the world is the history of Western thought. Right? The history of Western thought is the thoughtless thought of the world. In that sense, you see what I'm saying? So that's why we need a fundamental ontology. We need in that sense of the word, a pre-thinking. Right? We have to think back. We have to think before. And so I characterize in the Novitas Mundi, I think it's there that I characterize, certainly by the time I get the foundation, but I think already there, I characterize Heidegger's thinking as thinking essentially in the past, which I think covers a lot of bases here. Right?
Does he think that in being in time he's now doing that fundamental thinking?
Well,
So
he's doing that fundamental thinking as a project. I mean, it's not a finished project, and I think the project nature of the enterprise is so profound that there is no end to the project that, as it were, the project can give itself, and therefore you have this tension, as it were, between, which becomes more explicit in the later Heidegger, I think, between Dasein and being, and there's a kind of mutual dependence or mutual independence, right? So Dasein, in a certain sense, is waiting for what gives time, what gives being, and that already becomes something of a question, right? And on the other hand, he will say something to the effect in the Beiträge that being, in some sense, needs Dasein. Dasein has an irreducible role. And again, it's analogous to the notion that, in the thinking now occurring, that the creature at this point in time, because, as I put it in the ethics seminar, omnipotence has moved to new ground. That the creation of the world is, as it were, altogether in the hands of the creature in the context of thinking now occurring. There's the short of that which in Heidegger is tending in that direction, is that if there were something like the creation ex nihilo of the world in Heidegger, whatever is analogous to that in Heidegger, needs Dasein to happen. Now, it may need Dasein in the way of this patient waiting, do you see? And then the only difference between what Heidegger is saying and what the thinking now occurring is saying is that the wait is over. And that's what I said to Fold, is that I didn't say it to him. I said it to somebody else. I sent him a copy of the email. It just flipped him out. He just thought that was great to know that the wait was over, and it is, right? But he thinks it's over in the Hegelian way. It can't be over in the Hegelian way. But the waiting is over, and therefore it's not that this thinking is not true as far as it goes, but as far as it goes, belongs altogether to the past, right? But it is no injustice to this thinking that it belongs to the past, because, as I put it in Novitas Mundi, it is essentially rooted in the past, right? Even if it's only rooted in some sort of ultimate past. So I want to say, on behalf of an omnipotence that has set us absolutely free, that it has done no injustice to any of the participants. You see? And in that sense, on another more pedestrian level, I think it was something that comes up with when Chuck is here. The thinking now occurring is not opposed to Heidegger. It's not opposed to Hegel. Do you see? In fact, I would want to say that short of the thinking now occurring, what Heidegger is saying is true. I would say it certainly was true. You see? Just as in its own place, what Hegel said was true. It was true. So in a certain sense. Now, there is another sense in which what was true within the limits of self-consciousness may ultimately be understood in some sense to be false. Maybe even then, so to speak. And that goes to another issue, which I'm not going to go off on now, but it goes to the question of the ban, which becomes a big issue in the analysis of Agamben. The ban of sacred doctrine, as I call it in the... And the connection with what, just to tie a little link here, make a little link back to something we were saying before. If I say that something like, and again, I'm gonna, I think, deliberately and importantly hedge or fudge this likeness. Something like creation ex nihilo, if I'm going to find it in modernity, implicitly it's going to be in the area of the will. And I don't know whether I don't think I said, but remember that Thomas himself says somewhere in passing, I think it's in passing, that by the way, he doesn't say by the way, of course, the way in which the creature is most in the image of God is by virtue of the will. And Descartes picks up on this. And so I have, as far as will goes, says Descartes in the Meditations, my will and God's will are, qua will, they're no different, because there are no limitations on my freedom to choose any more than there are in God. The difference between me and God, for Descartes, is that God has an unlimited intellect, and I have this poor, puny, finite mind, so I have to be careful, even though I have as much freedom as God has. I have to be careful not to jump to conclusions, right? I have to have the clarity and the distinctiveness of the idea so undeniably in front of my mind that I can justify assenting to its truth. Right? That's what Descartes is at. But what I'm getting at is that the divine element, and it's part of the theology, Christian theology, is that God creates the world by an act of will. So if you want to reduce even though he does it in and through the word, which would be the understanding, he does it, you see, and he does it, and Thomas also says he gets them all in the act, because you can't really take these three guys apart, in the Trinitarian theology. Even though they're really different persons, they never act. None of them ever leaves the room. Okay. So the Spirit is the principle of the creation. The Word is the logos in and through whom the creation is made. But the Father's act of creation is ultimately, well, that's going to distort it. The power of the Father is to create. The understanding of the Son is the way in which it's created, so to speak. But if I were to think of this in Hegelian terms, and there's some justification for this in the Augustinian Thomistic notion, the middle guy is the Spirit. So in other words, will here as the love of the Father for the Son. It's that unifying third person that for Thomas is both the will of God, so perfectly so that it is a separate or a distinct person. It's that distinct person, the will of God, that is the principle of the creation. That is, as it were, the principle would be the Latin principium, right? Would be the equivalent in what we would say, or in Greek you would say the arche, or in English we would want to say the beginning of the creation, right? So it's if it were rooted, if you could root it in anything, it would be rooted in an act of will. Is what it comes down to. Okay. I want to move, since I said I was going to do it, and I want to keep my promise here, to and this issue that you were raising about the relationship of the world and nothing. I think that was your basic issue, and it occurs in the context of the discussion of Angst 171 and following in particular, which in turn, by the way, is taking place in the context of the notion of care. And speaking of will, by the way, on 171, if you look at the top paragraph, the last sentence, such phenomena are will, wish, predilection, urge. Care cannot be derived from them because they are themselves founded upon it. So when we say, as I said a moment ago in the context of my response, my elaborated response to your original question, that will is something that Heidegger wants to get under, get beyond, get under. Notice how he does it. He gets under in the notion of care, right? So will is derived, will and wish and analogous things are derived from care. So he gets, if I put it in historical terms, he gets under Descartes' resolve to found a new science. He gets under that very resolve by saying, well, wait a minute, you were so anxious to get on with the busyness of creating a new science, right? You were so anxious that you immediately you took your will as the starting place for a new science. If you had been more patient, if you had been right, you might have. You couldn't actually do this, right? But if you were Heidegger, you would want, as it were, ground or root the will, the resolve of modernity in care, but not to the exclusion of resolving all of being there, going back to the ancients, going all the way back in care, right? But will be among the things that are derived from care would be will. Okay. So in the next paragraph, like any ontological analysis, the ontological interpretation of Dasein is care, with whatever can be gained from the interpretation, is far removed from what is accessible to the pre-ontological understanding of being, or even to our ontic acquaintance with beings. At the bottom of that paragraph, last couple of sentences, 4 up from the bottom. Thus, we need a pre-ontological confirmation of the existential interpretation of Dasein as care. It lies in demonstrating that as soon as Dasein expressed anything about itself, it has already interpreted itself as care, although only pre-ontologically. The analytic of Dasein, which penetrates to the phenomenon of care, is to prepare the way for the fundamental ontological problematic, the question of the meaning of being in general. All right, so let's read through a little bit more of this paragraph. So in order to direct our view explicitly to this in light of what we have gained and to go beyond the special task of an existential a priori anthropology, the phenomena which are most intimately connected with the leading question of being must be grasped more precisely in hindsight. They are the modes of being explained hitherto, handiness and objective presence, which determine inner-worldly beings unlike Dasein. Dropping down a few lines. We need to discuss the ontological connection of care, worldliness, handiness, and objective presence. This leads to a more exact determination of the concept of reality. And then over on page 172, Beings are independently of the experience, cognition, and comprehension through which they are disclosed, discovered, and determined. But being is only in the understanding of that being to whose being something like an understanding of being belongs. Thus, being can be unconceptualized, but it is never completely uncomprehended, which is a point that he has and we have been emphasizing all along. So at the bottom 2 sentences of that paragraph, thus for an adequate preparation of the question of being, we need an ontological clarification of the phenomenon of truth. This will be accomplished initially on the basis of that which our interpretation hitherto has gained, with the phenomenon of disclosedness and discoveredness, interpretation and statement. The conclusion of the preparatory fundamental analysis of Dasein thus has, as it seemed, the fundamental attunement of Angst as a distinctive disclosedness of Dasein. The being of Dasein is care, the confirmation of the existential interpretation of Dasein is care in terms of the pre-ontological self-interpretation of Dasein, Dasein, worldliness and reality, Dasein, disclosedness and truth. And then the fundamental attunement of Dasein as the eminent disclosedness of Dasein. And to what extent is Angst in the first paragraph in the middle a distinctive attunement, and with the intention in the next paragraph of penetrating to the being of the totality of the structural whole, will take the point of departure from the concrete analysis of entanglement. The absorption of Dasein in the day and in the world taken care of reveals something like a flight of Dasein, a fall of Dasein away from itself, as an authentic potentiality of being itself. This phenomenon of the flight of Dasein from itself and its authenticity seems, so what is he telling us? We have an authentic flight from authenticity. Right? So again, you see, for want of a better word, the tension of being and nothing. Right? It's not a simple determination in which I can distinguish one from the other. Subsequently, in Hegel, right? I don't have a determinate notion, but I have a notion of what I'm calling here a kind of irreducible tension, a nearness, in his language, I guess you could say. In this flight, Dasein precisely does not bring itself before itself, but as he would want to say, I can't have speech without silence. I can't have a flight from itself without some notion of the being of Dasein with itself, the staying with itself, right? So this tension is, you could say, I would say, irreducible. In accordance with its own most trait of entanglement, this turning away leads away from Dasein. But in investigating such phenomena, our inquiry must guard against conflating existential characteristics with ontological existential interpretation, and must not overlook the positive phenomenal foundations provided for this interpretation by such a characterization. It is true that existentially, the authenticity of being itself is closed off and repressed in entanglement, but this closing off is only the privation of a disclosedness. That's the point about silence and speech, right? Silence is a privation of speech. There's no concept of... So now how can we, close to his text, how can we understand being and nothing in this pre-ontological analysis, analytic of Dasein? We can understand it as that nothing is a privation of being. And qua privation of being, it is not simply nothing. Do you see? Okay, and by the way, there he's being, in his own way, very Aristotelian way of thinking. Okay, so a privation of a disclosedness which reveals itself phenomenally in the fact that the flight of Dasein is the flight from itself, only because Dasein is ontologically and essentially brought before itself by the disclosedness belonging to it, can it flee from that which it flees. All right. So only because it is brought to itself can it flee from itself. Might be a way of simplifying it. But in turning away from it, it is there disclosed on account of its character being disclosed. Okay, now, so he says, in effect, I don't know whether he says somewhere on that page, he uses the term, I wrote it down here, I can't find it, I must have underlined it, but you'll find it. Just note that somewhere there he says it's the eminent disclosedness of Dasein. Angst is the, right? So the very fleeing from the being itself that Dasein is in its disclosedness to itself. That angst itself is the preeminent disclosedness of Dasein. So you could say, again, a little tipping of the hat to Hegel in a very different dimension now, in a very different world, so to speak, a very different understanding of world, nevertheless is what? That the disclosedness of Dasein, the preeminent disclosedness of Dasein is in the negative. It's in the fleeing from. It's in the alpha privative. Okay? And that is the original, as it were, the already existing authentic being of Dasein's being in the world. It is originally and authentically in flight from itself originally. And that's why, right? And the preeminent disclosedness of its lostness in the world, you see, of its fallenness. See, this has a theological resonance anyway. You see in Kierkegaard and elsewhere. Is angst. Angst is the awakening to the fact of its fallenness. Okay, and in 174, which comes to Adam's point, I think, we have the question of the 174 and 175, I guess. In the middle of 174, just about 3 lines into the middle main paragraph on 174, the long one, that about which one has angst is being in the world as such. Okay, which is another way of saying Dasein has angst about itself, right? Or Dasein's fear of itself is grounded more primordially in an angst which is an anxiety about being in the world. And then he says at the bottom of 174, thus neither does angst see a definite there and over here from which what is threatening approaches. So fear, for example, is always fear. Fear is less primordial than angst, right? The fear of something is, as it were, a manifestation, you see, of our more fundamental anxiety. We fear this thing actually is a covering over of the deeper fear, the angst, which is a fear which is not a fear of anything in particular. You say, which is the fear of being in the world, period, as such, as he would put it and does put it. The fact that what is threatening is nowhere characterizes what angst is about. The fact that what is threatening is nowhere characterizes what angst has about. Now that nowhere, you have to be careful here. It's like the nothing being thing, right? In other words, it's the nowhere is the alpha privative of the there or the where, right? It's not sheer nothingness again, right? It's the
next sentence. Yeah,
angst does not know what it is about, which it is angst, but nowhere does not mean nothing. Rather, region in general lies therein, and disclosedness of the world in general for essentially spatial being in. Therefore, what is threatening cannot approach from a definite direction. Okay, because in other words, it's not a specific region of being; it's region in general. And therefore, it cannot come from a specific or definite direction, what it is that's threatening, as it can in the case of fear. I fear the elephant is going to run over me, right? It is already there and yet nowhere. And that's the point. It's there is yet nowhere. There, I would put it another way, there is yet not there. Okay? It is so near that it is oppressive. Okay, so what's the relationship, right, of this indeterminate, predetermined, I think it's probably the better way of putting it. This predeterminate relation of being and nothing, it's again nearness, right? It is so near that it is oppressive and stifles one's breath, and yet it is nowhere. And as he says elsewhere, angst is not a matter of conceptualization, right? It's attunement. It's the preeminent mode of attunement, and the preeminent mode of attunement as disclosedness of Dasein, right? So in what angst is about at the top of 175, the it is nothing and nowhere becomes manifest. Implicit, by the way, in that. Why does he do that? He does it several times. It's not an accident. Nothing and nowhere. Well, where is a place or space notion. So what does that tell us about the nothing he's referring to here? I say it's the predeterminate, which is nearest to Dasein, near to the being, from which it would only be distinguished in any way in modern metaphysics at the moment of determination. So the being that's hidden in that nothing is the being about which he's already told us very early on, which he's already told us very early on, is itself temporal, right? So the nothing and the nowhere are the no time, the non-temporal, the non-being. So nothing here is concrete. It's not only anxiety has to do with something that I'm afraid which is nowhere, not coming from any direction, but it's also not being. It's nothing, but not in this simply empty sense. It's no. I want to say it's no particular time. There might be something there. Let me think about that. Okay. I just want to get to the specific passage, which it's already built up here at the bottom of 74, but on 175, so what oppresses us is not, at the beginning of the second paragraph on page 175, is not this or that, nor is it everything objectively present together as a sum, but the possibility of things at hand in general, that is the world itself, is what is oppressing us. When angst has quieted down in our everyday way of talking, we are accustomed to say it was really nothing. This way of talking, indeed, gets at what it was ontically. Everyday discourse aims at taking care of things at hand and talking about them. That about which angst is anxious is none of the inner worldly things at hand, but this none of the things at hand, which is all that everyday circumspect discourse understands, is not a total nothing. This is the precise passage I was referring to. So he says, not a total nothing. The nothing of handiness is based on the primordial something on the world. So in other words, see, it's based on a primordial something, on that primordial something, which again is predeterminate. Right? The world, as he says, I think, what did he say early on in another context? The world is not a thing. The world is not an inner worldly thing, and the world is not a being. That's another way he put it. You see? So the world that's not a being, you would say, oh, then it's a total nothing. No. It's not a being, right? But it is it's a predeterminate something, and because it's predeterminate, it causes a lot of anxiety in Dasein, which finds itself in this predeterminate something or other, right? And the way I overcome it is by becoming a philosopher. That's the way I overcome my anxiety. I spend all my time thinking about the world, you see?
At the bottom he says, what angst is anxious about, more or less, is being in the world.
Yeah, okay. So the nothing of hand is based on primarily something on the world. The world, however, ontologically belongs essentially to the being of Dasein as being in the world. So if what angst is about exposes nothing, that is the world. Now, this is what I want to. The nothing that it exposes is the world as such, but the world as such is not a determinate nothing. Do you see? Okay. Because it was that Hegel already did that. He already did that. So the world as such. This means that about which angst is anxious is being in the world itself. Okay. So being anxious discloses primordially and directly. I guess that would be both of those words taken together would be the key. The world as world. And directly, I want to say that also parts company with Husserl. Right? To primordially and directly, or to speak of the world primordially and directly disclosed in angst, is to get beyond the essence of the world, as which we're going to say is where Husserl is at phenomenologically. Get beyond the essence, or get before the essence of the world to the world. So the worldliness of the world in general, you see, would be this world that is directly and primordially disclosed in angst, and that gets beyond the relative abstractness that could be said, I think, to characterize phenomenology as practiced by Husserl. Right? And there again, to bring together in what I'm calling a predeterminate way, the ontic and the ontological,